Today, we have to talk about something that no Cowboys fan wants to hear, especially after the optimism we had back around Thanksgiving. At that time, it felt like everything was lining up perfectly for Dallas to receive the fifth-round compensatory picks, and the whole draft outlook looked even brighter because of it. There was a significant development with Rico Dowdle that made the possibility seem very real, and the compensatory pick chart was pointing toward a major win in terms of draft capital. But now, with the season officially over and the updated numbers in, the reality is much less exciting. The Cowboys are no longer in line to receive those fifth-round picks, and that shift changes the conversation heading into the draft. To understand what happened, we first need to break down what compensatory picks are and how they work. These picks are essentially the NFL's way of rewarding teams that lose more valuable free agents than they sign. It is not about players who were cut or traded. Those departures do not impact the compensatory pick formula. The system is built around the idea that if a team loses more or better free agents than it brings in, it should receive extra draft capital to help balance the scales. The full formula is not public, but the main factors are the annual value of the contract and the percentage of snaps a player plays. That snap count is especially important because if a player is injured or just not on the field it reduces the value of the comp pick. Over the years, the league has also tightened up loopholes, making it harder to manipulate the system by cutting and re-signing players. Still, projections are not perfect, and there is always some margin for error, especially for players who are on the edge of qualifying. Back in November, the projections looked really promising for the Cowboys. They were expected to receive multiple compensatory picks, though some of them would cancel out with outgoing picks. The projections included a fifth-round compensatory pick for DeMarcus Lawrence, another fifth-round pick for Jordan Lewis, and several sixth-round compensatory picks for players like Brandon Cook, Chance Goulston, Chuma Dogba, and Rico Dowdle. On the other side of the ledger, the Cowboys were projected to lose compensatory picks for players such as Dante Fowler, Solomon Thomas, Robert Jones, and Javonte Williams. When all of that was added up, the net result looked like the Cowboys would walk away with the fifth-round compensatory picks, and that was the part that had fans excited. Rico Dowdle's strong performance late in the season seemed to push him over the threshold to qualify, and that helped ensure that one of those fifth-rounders would not be canceled out. If that had happened, it would have been a much less favorable outcome, but at the time, the outlook was clearly optimistic. Unfortunately, those projections have now shifted, and the main reason for the change is Jordan Lewis. The updated numbers now show that Lewis no longer qualifies as a fifth-round compensatory pick. Instead, he is projected as a sixth-round pick, and the difference comes down to something that feels almost cruel. Lewis suffered a season-ending foot injury in Week 16, and he had already missed multiple games earlier in the year due to a neck injury. Even though he played well and had a strong season overall in Jacksonville, his snap count dropped enough to push him below the fifth-round cutoff. The final tally shows he played only about 55.8% of the snaps, and that was enough to move him from the fifth-round threshold to the sixth-round level. The difference between those two outcomes is only about 3% in snap percentage, but that tiny margin is what cost the Cowboys that second fifth-round pick based on the current projections. That is where the compensatory system can feel especially harsh. 3% is such a small margin, and it is the kind of thing that feels almost unfair because it is largely out of the team's control. Once the season is over, the numbers are what they are, and the formula does not account for the context behind why a player missed time. It just treats the data as pure facts, and in this case, the facts did not fall in the Cowboys' favor. That said, projections are not the final word. There is still a chance that the NFL's official calculation could differ slightly from what the projection sites are showing. Sometimes the league's final numbers end up being different, and players can be bumped up or down compared to the projections. So while the current outlook is disappointing, there remains a small window where the final compensatory picks could still surprise us. We will have to wait for the official announcement, which typically comes right before free agency starts in March, to know for sure. Even with the updated outlook, the other compensatory picks remain largely the same. DeMarcus Lawrence is still projected as a fifth-round compensatory pick, and the sixth-round picks for Brandon Cook and Rico Dowdle are still expected to be awarded. In fact, Rico Dowdle even moved up to a sixth-round compensatory pick, which is not a major change but is still worth noting. On the cancellation side, Chance Goulston remains a 6th-round cancellation, and Chuma Dogba is still a 7th-round cancellation. When all of that is added together, the Cowboys are now projected to receive 1 5th-round compensatory pick instead of 2. That shift is disappointing, but it does not completely derail the team's draft outlook. The key now is to stay flexible and watch for the official numbers, because even a small change could alter the final result. One possible variable that could still affect the final outcome involves Robert Jones. His situation is interesting because it could influence whether the Cowboys end up with an additional compensatory pick. Even if it does not change the 5th-round picture, Jones signed a 1-year deal worth $3.75 million, but he did not play at all due to a neck injury. Most of that deal was base salary and signing bonus, which would have been paid regardless. The remaining $750,000 was tied to per-game roster bonuses, and because he did not play, it is likely those bonuses were not earned if those incentives are not counted in the compensatory pick calculation. It could move Jones's contract outside the qualifying range. That would mean the compensatory pick the Cowboys were expected to lose for him might not actually cancel out one of the other gains, potentially giving Dallas an extra late-round pick. It is a small chance, but it is one of the few remaining ways the compensatory picture could improve. Another point worth considering is that the compensatory pick system is not always perfectly aligned with the actual impact a player has on the field. There are players who contribute significantly to a team but do not generate the contract value or snap percentage needed to qualify for a compensatory pick. That can make the process feel a bit unfair because it does not always reward teams for losing key contributors. In the Cowboys' case, there were a few players who just missed the cut, and that is part of why the projections ended up where they are. Cooper Rush, for example, did not qualify in the projections, and his snap count was initially listed incorrectly before being updated. Even with the correction, his numbers were not enough to push him into the qualifying range. Trey Lance is another example of a player whose deal looked larger on paper than it actually was, due to incentives that were not met. These are the kinds of details that make the compensatory process feel like a guessing game until the final numbers are revealed. Even with the disappointment of losing one of those 5th-round picks, there is still plenty of reason for Cowboys fans to feel optimistic about the draft. The team still has the 1st-round selections, and that alone gives them a huge advantage in shaping the roster. The difference between one extra 5th-round pick and 2 is not insignificant, but it does not change the fact that Dallas can still walk away from the draft with a class that includes impact players and long-term starters. The key now is for the front office to stay flexible, to monitor the compensatory pick announcement, and to plan for multiple scenarios. The draft is still the biggest event on the calendar, and it will be fascinating to see how the Cowboys use their capital to build around the core they already have. One of the things that makes the compensatory pick situation so frustrating is that it is driven by numbers that often feel disconnected from the reality of the game. A player can be a key contributor, but if the contract value or snap percentage does not meet the threshold, the team does not get rewarded. That is part of why the system can feel like a guessing game until the league finally publishes the official numbers for the Cowboys. The most painful part of this year's projection change is how close Jordan Lewis was to keeping that 5th-round status. 3% of snap percentage is all that separated him from maintaining a 5th-round compensatory pick. And it is the kind of margin that makes you feel like the system is almost designed to be cruel. Injuries happen and players miss time, and the compensatory formula does not account for those circumstances. It just treats the numbers as they are, and in this case, the numbers were not in Dallas' favor. Looking ahead, the most important thing for fans to remember is that compensatory picks are not guaranteed. Until the league officially announces them, projections are useful, but they are not final. The Cowboys have been on the wrong side of this system before, and this year is another example of how unpredictable it can be. That uncertainty is part of what makes the offseason so interesting, because it means teams have to plan for multiple outcomes. The Cowboys will likely have a strategy in place for the draft, but they will also be ready to adjust if the compensatory picks end up being different than expected. That is the reality of building a roster in the modern NFL. You have to be prepared for changes, and you have to be able to pivot quickly. One of the remaining variables to watch is how the league treats incentives in contracts like Robert Jones' deal, if those per-game roster bonuses are counted as part of the contract value, it could keep him within the qualifying range and maintain the compensatory pick the Cowboys were expected to lose if they are not counted. Then his contract could fall outside the range, and that could change the cancellation picture. That one small detail could be enough to give the Cowboys another pick in the later rounds, which would soften the blow of losing a fifth-rounder. It is the kind of nuance that most fans do not think about, but it can have real consequences. The compensatory formula is a delicate balance, and even a small shift can ripple through the entire calculation. Another angle to consider is that the compensatory pick system does not always match up with the actual value of the players a team loses. There are players who make a significant impact but do not generate the contract value or snap percentage needed to qualify. That is part of why the Cowboys had players who were close but did not quite make the cut. Cooper Rush, for example, did not qualify in the projections, even though he did play and contribute in certain situations. Trey Lance is another example of a player whose deal looked larger on paper than it was in reality, because many of the incentives were not earned. These details are part of what makes the compensatory process feel unpredictable, and they are also why projections can change between the initial estimates and the final results. For Cowboys fans, the big takeaway is that the draft is still the main event, and the team's position is still strong. Even without the extra fifth-round pick, Dallas has the ability to add talent in key areas. Whether the Cowboys decide to prioritize the offensive line, strengthen the secondary, or add more weapons to the offense, they have the draft capital to make meaningful moves. The front office will likely be evaluating players and scenarios, and they will have to make decisions based on the final compensatory picture. The draft is always a time of hope and excitement, and the Cowboys still have plenty to be excited about, even if the compensatory news was disappointing. In the end, this situation is a reminder of how complex and unpredictable the NFL can be behind the scenes. It is not just about what happens on game day. It is also about how contracts are structured, how players are used, and how the league awards compensatory picks. The Cowboys have dealt with this system before, and it is never easy to see the projections change in a way that feels like a setback. But the draft is still a huge opportunity, and the team's front office will have a chance to add players who can make an immediate impact. The compensatory pick news is a setback, but it does not define the entire offseason. The Cowboys still have the chance to build a strong class and continue building toward a championship. Before we roll on, subscribe to Cowboys Wire News. Drop a like and turn on the bell. Your support keeps the Dallas Cowboys updates coming. Tell us what you think in the comments. Whispers around the league corridors have grown louder after a formal complaint from the Cowboys reportedly landed on the commissioner's desk, triggering what insiders describe as a rare and uncomfortable review process, according to sources close to the situation. League officials have privately acknowledged that a sanction is on the table, even as they publicly maintain a careful silence. The tension escalated dramatically when previously unseen images began circulating among executives, footage that some have labeled as disturbing enough to force the NFL's hand. The Cowboys camp is said to believe the images reveal actions that go beyond routine on-field controversy, while nothing has been confirmed. The material allegedly challenges the league's long-standing commitment to consistency in officiating and discipline. One league insider suggested that the reaction inside headquarters was immediate, with several senior figures requesting additional angles and enhanced breakdowns before forming an opinion. The mere existence of this internal scramble has fueled speculation that the case is more serious than initially assumed. Around the NFL, rival teams are watching closely. There is a sense that whatever decision emerges could set a precedent, especially if the league follows through with punishment after pressure from one of its most high-profile franchises. Some executives quietly worry about opening a door that could lead to a wave of similar complaints, while others argue that failing to act would be even more damaging to the league's credibility. Fans, meanwhile, are left to piece together fragments of information, debating whether the images truly change the narrative or simply amplify an already polarized debate. The Cowboys supporters insist the visuals confirm what they have argued all along, while skeptics caution that rumors often grow faster than facts in moments like this. For now, the NFL's promise of a potential sanction hangs in the air, suspended between expectation and uncertainty. If the league ultimately acts, it will be seen as a response not only to a complaint, but to the unsettling power of images that refuse to stay hidden. That's a wrap from Cowboys Wire News. For breaking Cowboys updates, subscribe, drop a like, and turn on the bell. Tell us your take in the comments.